Hi guys, welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you're new here. Today we're going to be talking about shared ownership, and it's something I haven't spoken about in quite a while actually, because I've been going back and forth on it a lot in my mind, and I had a comment that really made me sit and think about it for quite a while, and the person commented, I'll just put the comment here so you can see it. They made some really good points about the scheme, and I think that they're so important to talk about this because it's really difficult to make videos on a scheme that is so nationwide. It's a national scheme and applies to so many cities in the UK. I did respond to that person eventually after I'd thought about it a long time. I really wanted to think about, their points. I really wanted to think about their points and have a good response to it, but I thought it would be important that we just discuss it here as well, because I have been making a few videos about shared ownership in the past. It's a scheme I've personally considered, so I really wanted to talk about this because I think it's important. So let's just get into it, right? So you've seen the comment here. One of the biggest things that comes up quite a bit, like in this comment, I guess, and that in general about the scheme, is that it's a cycle of debt. And I completely understand that. That makes sense, okay? It being a cycle of debt. If you get in now and you can't afford to be in an open market, when you finally get out, hoping that housing prices have increased, even when you pull out your equity and you go to buy new homes or go to buy whatever home later on, it's still going to be unaffordable if your salary hasn't changed. They were saying that your salary would have had to increase 5 or 10 times for you to still be able to afford properties at the new rate that they are, which makes sense because of course housing prices generally go up. If they go up, you get a profit. That means they've gone up on the board, and then that means that houses are now more expensive anyways. If they've gone down, you've made a loss. So you still won't be able to afford those same houses because you don't have enough in equity from the sale to afford these houses. And that's a really good point in generally speaking. And so that was the whole basis on it being a cycle of debt. Yes, technically these are all what ifs, right? We're all going what if, but we don't even know what the situation will be in 10 years, which can be a good and a bad thing. It's either it's gonna get better and the government will have done more to step in and make affordability better, or it won't have and the situation's gonna be worse, and if anything, people will now be moving away from this. Firstly, I wanna put out there that I've lived in three countries. I've lived in 3 countries. This is, I was born and raised in London, and I've lived in Canada. I lived in Vancouver for 3 years. I lived in Seoul for 3 years. So I've seen housing prices like in different areas. I've also rented long-term abroad if I've gone on a long holiday. So I've seen like prices, and I've looked at the scale and index of how much it costs to live in each country. And I also know the schemes in some countries because I've considered living there. So like Vancouver, I know what they have available for housing. So I've seen housing across the board and how much it can cost in some countries. Vancouver, for example, Canada, they don't really have housing schemes like this. They have a couple, but they're not as extensive as the ones we have here. And honestly speaking, I think here we have so many options in comparison to so many other countries. And because I've lived in other countries and I know what it's like, their housing situations in other countries, Vancouver is completely unaffordable. I don't see myself ever buying a house unless I'm balling and I really want to move there and live in the city. I don't see myself ever buying a house there because the average cost of a house in Vancouver is $1 million. I'm just telling you now. So I know how expensive it is outside of where I'm living now. My family are in London. I was born and raised in London. Most of my friends live here. I have friends all over the world, but my biggest base is here in London, and it's partly the reason I moved back. So my point, I responded to the comment, and I'll show you what I wrote here. My point is that this scheme only works for there's like a very specific set of cases where I think this scheme works really well for someone. There are a majority of cases where it probably it's not worth getting into. Like, you're better off saving more money to afford to do like either Help to Buy or just buy outright, okay? And the cases in which I think that is that you don't live in London, for starters. Like, That's the biggest one. You do not live in London. If you do not live in London, you have options. I'm gonna tell you now, you have so many options. I'm gonna guess you have options just because I've looked at how much it costs outside of London and I've considered like different cities and living there. You got options. The average price of a 2-bedroom flat in London, if we're looking at new builds, 400,000 on the low end, I'd say 350 to 400,000 low end. For a 2-bedroom flat, like 600 square feet, like it's not that big. It's a tiny little flat and it's expensive. So these are the specific cases. For me personally, shared ownership, I'm gonna tell you like my situation. Number 1, I'm self-employed. Number 2, my husband's self-employed. Number three, he's Canadian. We're stacked on the odds here. He's Canadian, so he's here on a spousal visa, and he was originally here on his youth mobility. So these are like things that really stack against you when you're looking to invest in property or to buy property in the UK. Number 4, we're both, as I said, self-employed, so our income fluctuates and varies, and there are so many things that you have to prove around your income when you're self-employed. So those are my specific set of circumstances. Oh, number 5, we live in London. Like, we live in London, my family's in London. London is our base, he works in London, he has an office in London. Like, this is our home, you know? And this is our base, and we don't really have any options to move out of London right now. So we have this very specific set of circumstances stacked against us, or towards us, however you like to put it. But in the sense of buying a home, those are very much stacked against us. If you want to live in London, I have lots of friends who live in London and work in London. I was actually speaking to someone who owns a property. I didn't even know she owned a shared ownership property, and she was telling me it was great for her, and you know, it was really good opportunity at the time when she bought her place, because she lives in London. London is really unaffordable, and unless you're making, to afford like what, a 2-bedroom, 400,000, divide that by 400,000 divided by 4.5. To get a mortgage on somewhere that's about £400,000, you have to be making 88,888 pounds as a household. Okay, so unless you have a massive deposit, and bearing in mind, let's say this place is 450,000, because a deposit of 10% would be, £40,000. So let's say this place is £440,000. You'd have to be earning £89,000 as a household on the high end, no, on the low end, so above that. And that's where it becomes unaffordable for a majority of people who aren't earning that. That's just the way it is. Like, you know, as a couple, you need to be earning about 50k each, and that's a really high salary. I'm gonna say that's gonna be someone who's later on in their life, or who's in a really high industry, like you're in engineering, or you're working in an industry that pays really well, or you have like a government job that pays really well. The average household in the UK, hey Google, what is the average income of households in the UK?
On the website ons.gov.uk, they say, in financial year ending 2020, the period leading up to the coronavirus pandemic, median household income in the UK was £29,900, based on estimates from the Office for National Statistics Household Finances Survey.
There you go, £29,000. That's, so when you look at those numbers, like the median household, like average household income, and you look at those numbers, you were like, huh? How is anyone gonna afford to live in London? And like, or in the UK, like especially London, because this number is based off of London average of a 2-bedroom new build. They're not. That's exactly how. This is where it's kind of like case by case. If you live further out, and I said this in my response, if you live out further from London, you live in the UK somewhere else where it's a bit cheaper to buy housing, would I think shared ownership is a great option for you? Probably not. I'm not gonna lie, probably not. However, if you live in London and work in London and you actually can't move out, or you're not remote and you have no options but to stay in London, is getting a shared ownership property in London your best bet? Probably. So that's kind of where I'm coming at with this, and I really believe it's case by case. So I've also calculated what it would cost for us to move further outside of London, and I'm still considering this option because I've seen some properties that I'm like, ooh, still under shared ownership because you have to move really far out of London before it even becomes affordable. But I've looked outside of on the outskirts because I want somewhere greener, and I want basically trying to replicate like nature. I'm like trying to replicate living in Vancouver and being around the greenery because I miss that, and I really need, personally for me, I need space, I need nature to thrive, and I just need peace and quiet so I can film and just live. And you know, eventually we're gonna start a family, number one, and then again it gets more affordable, right? It gets more unaffordable when you start a family, but at some point we will start a family. And so I want to move a bit further out of the city because of the pollution, everything. It's just bad for me. This city is bad for me. I have allergic rhinitis. I can't be around this smog and this dust and construction. There's literally construction work going across the road, and I'm just like, I can't. I just can't. I've looked at moving further out just because I want the nature, but even then, it's still really unaffordable. It's almost cheaper to stay in London and commute a shorter distance than to move further out of London. To pay like 300 or 200 a month for traveling into London because we're not remote, or because I'm not technically remote. I work in film and I have to travel to location, and that's expensive. But thankfully it's not as often as my husband, who works 6 days a week and he can't be remote. This is a very complex situation. Our situation is very specific, and I've done a lot of the numbers. I've done the numbers for a couple of years. I've looked at the numbers. I've moved them as much as I could. I've considered so many alternatives. I've considered moving to like Europe and just buying an old house and renovating it, and I might still do that as like a side project later down the line while my husband's still here. Like it's something I've considered because he can't really leave right now. That's not an option because his office is here. That's that. And you know what? London has opportunities. London, he has friends here, he has my family, and I'm not going to be leaving London in any time soon while he is building his business, and I'm okay with that. So I've looked at all that I've done, I've crunched the numbers, and I've looked at the alternatives. So it being a cycle of debt, I get that. However, you need to really have a plan. Sorry, this is gonna be a long video. You need to really have a plan when you're going into shared ownership. You need to crunch the numbers and look at every way this can go. The worst case scenario and the best case scenario. Worst case scenario is you have to sell at short notice and you make a loss. That is like the worst case scenario. Or that you have a really bad housing association that decides they want to do something to the place and makes it really unaffordable for you because of service charges. Top tip on service charges, if you want to avoid this, is real top tip. It hurts my heart to tell you, but I will tell you, if you want to avoid this, look for houses. They're very rare. They really are very rare, and I've been looking for them. So hello competition out there. They're really rare, but the service charge on a house is roughly a 2-bedroom house is about 40 £50. So in comparison to where you can go up to like £200 a month in service charges because of the amenities, because it's your home and you don't own the land because every shared ownership is leasehold, but because you are more enclosed and they're not paying for electricity in the building, they're not paying for all those things that you would occur if you lived in a flat, the service charges are way lower. So if you can get your hands on a home, like a 2-bedroom home, 3-bedroom home, whatever you're looking for, that will actually change the game for you if you really have no option but to do shared ownership. So I've been looking at homes. However, the caveat again is that there aren't any really in London. Another top tip is if you find areas that are being regenerated. So there are certain areas that the government are putting lots of money in to make them better. It's basically gentrification. But you know what? Gentrification can work in your favor. So if you find a place and you find out early that they're regenerating this area, they're trying to reform it and make it into a safer, better nicer area, you can get in pretty cheap because the cost when they're starting it would be quite low just because the area isn't favorable. However, as they start building on it, that increases, which gives you a better chance of making a profit later on when you're moving because you got in early. However, it's still going to be cheaper when you get in, but service charges may start to increase because the area is getting nicer and maybe they're going to start doing things to your apartment or wherever you live. Like, generally it's going to become more expensive. However, when you sell, you also hopefully make a profit because of the appreciation in the area, and that gives you a better chance of not failing. If you move into an area that's really expensive, you don't know what's going to happen in the future. It might not keep becoming expensive. It might just plateau, or maybe something happens in that area, you know, is less favorable in the future, and then you make a loss. I think a good thing to talk about is staircasing. Staircasing, someone asked me this question. They asked about staircasing and how much it costs. It costs, essentially, from my research, it costs around a similar amount to how much it costs when you bought. So it can cost a similar amount because you have to get your place surveyed again. You have to get someone to come in and evaluate the cost of your home. So you're gonna have to pay all those solicitor fees. You're gonna have to pay a surveyor. Is it a surveyor? The person who comes and values your home. You're gonna have to pay all that. So you're gonna pay a lot to staircase. So with staircasing, I honestly do not, personally, I would never staircase because of this. Because unless you wanna live in your property forever. So that's the only time when I think staircasing, or for a very long time, that's the only time I think staircasing, in my opinion, benefits you, is if you plan to live there very long term and you want to cut down your rent charges. Just because it costs so much to staircase, so every time you're doing it, you're potentially losing out on the value that you're gaining by staircasing. Unless you're going to staircase to 100 or 75 in a very short amount of time, every time you staircase, you're gonna have to pay the current value of that property. If your property is going higher, you're gonna have to pay more to staircase. If you go above the threshold for stamp duty, you're gonna have to pay that stamp duty on top of that. So you really have to think about that before you do it. So personally, if I get a shared ownership property, I plan to get the smallest percentage possible, hopefully 25%, 35 at the most. 35 for like the nicest, like a place where I'm like, oh my God, this is the place I really want to live. But 25 if possible. And I will not staircase. I don't think we're ever gonna staircase because it costs too much to staircase, and it's really hard to sell a place that has been staircased, especially if you staircase to a high amount. And there are many people who have said this, and it makes sense. Because if you sell your place and it's not 100%, the person who buys it next has to buy it at that current staircase amount. So if you staircase to 50%, the next person you're selling it to has to buy it at 50% share price. And that could be unaffordable for someone who's joining the scheme. The reason people join a scheme is because housing is unaffordable. So you have to really think about that before you staircase. So before you even buy, just think about if you want to staircase, how much you want to staircase, and if possible, try and start coming up with a plan to staircase in a short amount of time, whatever you have to do to not incur those extra costs and to not be stuck with a property you can't sell. And outside of that, yeah, living in London is really unaffordable. So I really believe that this scheme, honestly, I personally think the only place that this scheme really works is if you have a very specific set of circumstances, like I listed mine. You live in a major city like London, or a city that is very expensive and you cannot move out. Like, you have no choice but to live in that city, i.e. London. So I only think that this scheme really works if you have a plan. So you're not planning to staircase gradually, I mean, unless you plan to live there forever in this circumstance. So you're not planning to staircase gradually because you will be potentially losing value and it will be harder to sell potentially later on. This is me just guessing. There are new rules around shared ownership that I might talk about later if you guys want to talk about it, but I'm currently talking about it now because those won't come into play until around 2022, 2023. So it's not even relevant right now because you can't even get those rules right now on the properties that have been sold currently. So that information is not useful until later on, maybe this year. Probably properties that start being built towards the end of this year. But yeah, so you live in a major city that is really expensive like London. You don't plan to staircase and you plan to keep your property as low cost as possible for when you sell it so that you can make your profit. But obviously your rent will be higher, so you have to look at the numbers and see, is it cheaper for me to rent? Is it cheaper for me to do shared ownership? You read your lease really well. A lot of the time it's research issues that people come up against. So many problems because they don't look into it and they don't understand the worst case scenario. Build yourself an emergency fund. Build yourself a solid emergency fund when you're doing it. So specific set of circumstances, do the numbers, crunch the numbers. If I do go through the process, it's looking kind of hard just because there aren't a lot of properties out right now. And if I do go through the process, I will obviously talk a lot about it and just take you through it. So I'm willing to almost go through the process just so I can let you guys know how it is. As I said, I had a friend who did it. She said it was great for her, and I have another friend considering it. Maybe I could get them on and they can talk about their experiences, but yeah, I don't know. Personally for me, living in London, being self-employed, it's kind of the best option we have. Especially, oh, that's another thing I didn't talk about. It's gonna be a long video. Hope you're strapped in for this. Another thing in a comment was that this only really works if you're planning to move somewhere cheaper later. And I think for a lot of people, when they start in London, they don't plan to live in London forever. So I think this could work because I'm personally thinking I'm gonna buy in London and shared ownership, not gonna staircase, and the money we take out will go towards our new place, either in somewhere outside London, or by then we would have increased our income quite a bit. And that is quite likely and possible with us. Number one, I'm studying computer science right now and I'm planning to move into software engineering later on. And my husband is, he's a business owner. He owns his own business and he's going through the process of that is gonna completely change soon in a good way. So our set of circumstances are very specific around where we can estimate our income will be in 5 years' time. Your situation might be very different. I don't know if this works for someone who's already at their highest point of income. I don't think it works well, especially if you're later on in life. It could be harder to improve your income when you sell and then buy a new place. So unless you're planning to move out of London later on, it might not work for you. But if you're planning to move, let's say abroad later on, where the profit you make is enough that when you convert it to the local currency, it's now a big chunk of money that is gonna go towards a deposit on a new place across abroad somewhere, or whether you're gonna rent in a new place or whatever it is you decide to do later on. So for us personally, in 5 years, we could be up and selling and moving back to Canada for all I know. I don't know. But I'm just spitballing on possible case scenarios. I also know one other person who's considering selling their place. She's here on YouTube and you can kind of find out her story, and she would, if you want to know a bit more about her plans to sell her place and how hers went, if you haven't watched it already, her channel is called Panda and she's thinking about moving to Poland. And she's gonna sell her property and she's gonna build a new property in Poland. So it's worth following her kind of journey on that and seeing what her plans are, how she's found the scheme, because she made a video earlier on about it, I think last year about it, and how now she's trying to get out of the scheme to move somewhere else and use the profit on that to help with her build and move to Poland. So I think this scheme works really well if you are looking to move out of England or out of the city later on to put towards a deposit on a house, which will be a bit lower in cost, or a lot lower in cost actually. And if where you're currently renting is super unaffordable, like in London where rent is £1,000 plus, unless you are with a housing association or the council, which is quite rare and can be quite hard to get into. So yeah. Woo. Okay. So I just really wanted to like address those things and kind of talk a bit about my own specific situation in regards to why shared ownership is kind of one of the only options for us as a household. Currently, that might change in the future, but if we get to that point, we will cross that bridge when we get to it. I hope you found this useful. Do comment down below your own thoughts around it, because I know it does help other people to see other people who've either gone through it, who are thinking about going through it. So if you're in any of those boats, please comment down below and maybe like share your story, because I'm sure everyone would love to know what your experience was. If you have like a video on this, I know some people that have talked about this a bit, so please comment and let me know you have a video that you made on it so I can watch it, because I'm always looking for new experiences, because there isn't a lot of information out there, and I think it's important that we speak a bit more about it so everyone knows the best and the worst case scenarios. A lot of what is online right now is very negative, and I understand because people are motivated by that negativity because they want no one else to go through it. But I also find there aren't a lot of people talking about the good experiences. There are some, but it's quite rare. So if I can find any videos that I found recently that were really helpful, I'll try and put them in the description box below, so do check that out. Yeah, I hope you guys are doing well, and I'll see you next time for another video.